see here. Okay. Oh, how come that didn't? There we are. Okay. And let me set myself up here. Okay. So my talk involves the topic of softening of lenition of earlier voiceless stop onsets. They were voiceless stop onsets, but now these things that were in intervocalic position have been they're voiced and fricatives, and but this means that the words originally had presyllables. Okay, now this topic covers a lot of territory, not just changes in phonemes, because it involves the history of Vietnamese onsets broadly, and it's related to the history of monosyllabification in Viet Minh. There's also the question of the timing of these issues in relation to similar typological changes elsewhere in Viet Minh and in Sinitic languages, and among other languages in the region, but I'll, of course, focus on Vietic, Viet Minh, and Sinitic. And I'm going to revisit briefly my long-term question of the best way to characterize Sinitic Vietic language contact. I'm not going to say Sino-Vietnamese because 2,000 years ago there was not, there was no Vietnamese, right? It was something else. Sinitic Vietic language contact. I wrote an article when I was a much younger scholar in 2001, and the cheeky title, "What's so Chinese about Vietnamese?" And I was trying to mitigate the sense that somehow everything in Vietnamese is due to language contact with Chinese. Okay, well, the oversimplified statement is some is not, and some is uncertain, right? So still grappling with that. So today we have a large quantity of new additional data on many languages in the region, Vietic and otherwise. And as I presented at the workshop last year, there's a lot more ethnohistorical data to bring to the discussion. So this historical phonological topic is worth revisiting and revising, refining for various reasons, not just historical phonology, but language history more broadly. And we can attempt to answer some larger questions at the end of the talk. So Vietnamese is monosyllabic. Okay, by this I mean that Vietnamese, in Vietnamese, single syllables are both prosodic words and morphemes. Roots in Vietnamese are monosyllables. Okay, putting aside the Lai style reduplication, right? That's a separate word formation issue. It creates some complications, but basically roots in Vietnamese are monosyllables. And this monosyllabicity is like varieties of Chinese. So modern Chinese languages in Vietnamese, they're both are monosyllabic in the way I've described. They both also lack the kind of classical onset clusters. They have wa or something that's like wa, but not ra or la. And just that glide, very, very marginal onset clusters. And by the way, in Vietnamese, wa medials occur in only 10% of all syllables. That's from that database that James Kirby and I worked on last year. So they're functional, but still rather rare. So really pretty marginal. Now, both have complex tone systems, right? Obviously. And all syllables in both languages have phonemically distinctive tones. And of course, Sino-Vietnamese tones match Chinese tone categories with tremendous consistency, even matching some of the changes historically of other dialects. So this is a very Chinese-like typology, and it sometimes gives the impression that Vietnamese quickly became Chinese under intense contact, some kind of creolization or something like that. But of course, Vietnamese, it is an Austroasiatic language, and obviously there were major typological changes. And so, in some of my more recent publications, there's references at the end of the file. My Albus 2020 on Vietic historical syntax, I pointed out that at the time of initial language contact, right, Vietic and Sinitic, at the time of contact, the reconstructions suggest that they were both sesquisyllabic. And by sesquisyllabic, I mean bisyllabic with iambic stress pattern, bada. And they sometimes use the terms minor syllable and then major syllable, okay? They were both sesquisyllabic. They both had some kind of onset clusters with R and L. The various reconstructions kind of vary. Okay, clearly there was some kind of RL thing, and maybe both, but in any case, it was more than what there is now. And they both lack tone systems, and that's been around for, that idea has been around for more than a half century. So, and pretty well supported. And we'll hear about that, I guess, in a little while. So clearly Vietic had an Austroasiatic template at the time of this contact, and Sinitic was rather similar, right? But apparently undergoing transformation towards modern Chinese. It happened much earlier than Vietnamese. That's the thing. It happened in both, but it happened at different times. So Sinitic reached its modern typology in the early first half of the first millennium CE. Right? So 1500 years ago, it was already Chinese-like. Chinese was Chinese-like. That's a funny way to say it. The Middle Chinese period, right? In contrast, Vietnamese had pre-syllables into the early second millennium CE. So that's a long time, and had clusters with la until the early 1800s. So I'll give you the sources for that in a little while. Thus, we have to reconsider the scenario of how language contact with Sinitic influenced Viet Minh typology. So, okay, so let's look more broadly at previous research on these onsets, clusters, sesquisyllables in Vietnamese and Vietic. So, okay, now clusters like mla, blah, tla are clear in the data. They're clear from Chinese Nome texts. There's comparative data in Vietic languages. They're the Romanized texts, right, from the last 500 years, basically, or 400 or 500 years, 400 years, something like. I think we can say that the loss of those clusters, that really marks the end of Middle Vietnamese, right? Like that Gregerson described calling it Middle Vietnamese. But this loss is rather recent, just about 250 to 300 years ago, as Vu Nuc Nhieu noted most recently, well, yes, I guess 2020, but 2019, a paper he wrote. I think the recency of this is a major typological change, right? To say it really has lost almost virtually all the clusters. It's not widely known, right? And it's kind of counter to the Chinese typological template, right? Okay, next. While we know for certain that Vietnamese comes from a language ancestor with sesquisyllables, right, the pre-syllables, pre-sesquisyllables, like other Vietic languages, like Austroasiatic, the hypothesis of pre-syllables in what we can call archaic Vietnamese in the early second millennium, that comes primarily from textual data, right? And Shimizu, who's here, has done most of the work on that. Gong also focused on the Chinese loanwords in this category. What's especially helpful is that we now not only have not only an assemblage of comparative data and reconstructions for Vietic, right? We also have reconstructions of Old Chinese with sesquisyllables as per Baxter and Stegar. I'll come back to that. It's not their hypothesis is not without controversy, but at the very least, their data cannot be swished away casually. There's some pretty strong reasons for it, not the least of which it's Sino-Tibetan, so you kind of expect it at some point in its history. Lastly, I want to note Joe Pidiaporn's very useful article from 2015 on types of sesquisyllables, a typology of sesquisyllables in the region. They're not all the same, and I'll touch on that topic later with respect to Vietic. So let's review the main hypothesis. Vietnamese starts with Vietnamese versus Hmong onsets here. Okay, so in Vietnamese we have these voiced stops and voiced fricatives contrasting with voiceless stops in the varieties of Hmong. Okay, Fairloose summarized this from Maspero over a century ago. It's a very clean looking pattern of places of articulation, right? But cha, ba, da, but not quite ja, right? Not all voiced, but va, za, maybe ja, or perhaps ga, the voice velar fricative. The question is why? What are the phonological conditions for this, and why not in Hmong? And I'll get back to that question later, especially with implications of chronology. So Fairloose had gathered an incredible amount of data on archaic Vietic languages, such as Tivung, right? And so we see the same Vietnamese onsets in the left column, right? The va, za, ga, ba, da, cha. And then we see in Tavung these disyllabic words, of course, disyllables, really sesquisyllables. This data puts the Vietnamese onsets in an earlier intervocalic position. Excellent. We have an intuitively reasonable phonological environment for what I will simply call lenition, right? Fairloose called it spirantization, and I've seen this term, the term softening. I used it in my title. It's lenition, I guess, broadly speaking. Let's see what it looks like with available reconstructions today, 40 years after this publication. So Vietnamese onsets versus presyllables in Proto-Vietic and Proto-Austroasiatic using Shorto's Austroasiatic reconstructions, Fairloose's Vietic reconstructions with my own updates. So let's see here. Fairloose's basic hypothesis holds well. He noted that these conservative Vietic languages had these presyllables that pattern with Vietnamese onsets, right? So fine. So I've picked out some of these in Vietic and Austroasiatic that exemplify this. Note in these reconstructions, the consonants in front in Vietic, the consonants in front of the dots represent pre-sesquisyllables, not just consonants, okay? And Shorto similarly, he didn't use dots, but he used comparable notation for these sesquisyllables. Reconstructing vowels and sesquisyllables is highly problematic for reasons I don't have time to discuss, but just think of them as being potentially unstressed schwa. So for example, the Vietnamese field crab there, the unbarred d, the zam, think of the reconstruction as being something like Katam, okay, so that K, T-A-M. And down below, you'll see a capital C, and I'm going to use this notation elsewhere in the paper. Then that presyllable cannot be, the presyllable onset cannot be determined. Okay, it's a consonant. Some consonant we don't know. However, let me note that in general, there's this kind of co-occurrence restriction. You'll see you'll see K and T, P and T, K and P, but not P and P and K and that sort of thing. That's sort of a Vietic reconstruction issue, but I figured I'd just point it out. Okay, better not get distracted. Anyways, let's see the key data sources to reevaluate this hypothesis. Updated Proto-Vietic reconstructions based on over 24 Vietic languages and dialects. That's double that of Fairloose from 2007. So his stuff is solid, but I've added a lot of data. I've started reconstructing them myself, and I've got over 100 relevant Vietic edema in Vietnamese. Old and Middle Chinese reconstructions of Baxter and Stegar, and I'm focusing on their Old Chinese because they're the ones that propose the pre-syllabic material. Several dozen relevant instances of early Chinese loanwords. I'll use ECL for that. And this is from late Old Chinese to early Middle Chinese. Okay, so that's what I mean. Before late Sino-Vietnamese. Okay, pre-modern textual data in Nome and Chinese, as in the noted studies before, and the study of types of sesquisyllables in mainland Southeast Asia, primarily Austroasiatic. Okay, so I'm going to present the data, and I'm going to start with Vietnamese unbarred D, the Z, or Ya in the south and central. And I think they're, well, anyways. So here's, let's see, first look down the left column of the Proto-Vietic reconstructions that correspond to Vietnamese words with the Z sound. Okay, so zung, zung, zai, zui, and so on. I've highlighted the most commonly occurring ones in green. This is not the entire list. There are 24 items. I'll show you numbers in a moment here. But it's representative visually of what's most common and of what the range of the onset material is. Okay, you can see other types that are less common at the top and bottom there. Okay, and so here's some numbers: 24 Proto-Vietic items or reconstructions there. Whether it's true Proto-Vietic, we can't know, of course, but some of them are. If they were Austroasiatic, then they were presumably. But in any case, the deep reconstructions. And 16 of them have some kind of presyllable and T. Okay, but then we have this some with D, some with ya, and then just plain ya, the simplex, not a pre-syllable. Okay. For the early Chinese loanwords, there are 4 items, and they either have a T or D in the main syllable onset position. They all have, or 4 have pre-syllables. So they've been reconstructed by Baxter Cigar with the pre-syllables. Okay, so okay, good, interesting. The general pattern, we can just say the pre-syllable and some kind of alveolar, and we have z, which is okay. So fine, that kind of matches what Fairloose was presenting. So although pre-syllable plus T is the source about 2/3 of the time, right? We also have voice D, few instances of the palatals. So this is, we call it a general pattern. It's not absolute. Okay, this one of all these softened onsets, this is the most consistent one. All the others have other, even more variation in the source material and source forms. Okay, you'll see. So let's go to Vietnamese there, the GI there. Okay, and again, we have on the left column, you can see there, I've sort of highlighted the in green the palatal, those with the palatal stops in the main syllable onset position, intervocalic position, but we have some others. Okay, fine. Oh, please note that note that none of the intervocalic sounds are nasals. None of them are implosives. Okay, and this is also the case in Old Chinese. And this pattern that I'm describing, this lack of these, is consistent for all of these onsets in Vietnamese. I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so for this za here, we have 15 Proto-Vietic forms. It's a little more scattered, right? We can see that the pre-syllable plus cha is there 5 times, but it's a bit messier. And we have some more simplexes there and some other things that, don't totally know what to make of. 9 early Chinese loanword forms, and I'm going to call this somewhat speculative. They were reconstructed by Baxter and Cigar as having pre-syllables and then these various onsets, right? And I don't know always what the timing was, because Chinese itself was undergoing that collapsing of these this onset material, and then they, it may have contributed to that, so it contaminates this data. But the general pattern, at the very least, we expect it to be a pre-syllable plus palatal. Okay, it's, you can see plenty of that. But there's other stuff going on here. It's not as clean as the original hypothesis. So for the voiced velar fricative, we have good. We see lots of the pre-syllables plus K. Okay, good. That's what we want. Again, no intervocalic nasals. Okay, no implosive or some. I don't know what that would. Well, anyways, no implosives here. So 21 Proto-Vietic items, and we can highlight there that the pre-syllable plus K is predominant. We do have the G, also G or K simplexes, and then 30 early Chinese forms and early Chinese loanwords. And yes, these do have a lot of this pre-syllable plus K as well. Okay, well, that's looking a little stronger. But there's others, right? So it's not perfect. The general pattern, most common one is pre-syllable plus velar. Okay, that's good. Now, next one, Vietnamese V. The sources of Vietnamese V are truly diverse. So even in this case, the green highlighted ones we see B, P, and V. So there are implosive onsets at the top, but only in reconstructed monosyllables, not the bisyllabic forms. Okay, and note how interestingly they all have. I forgot to mention this. These all have the AA. That's Austroasiatic, Proto-Austroasiatic etyma. So something else we have to look into. Also notice, okay, so fine. Now we can look at the numbers. 40 that's a lot, Proto-Vietic items for Vietnamese V, and we see a large number of consonant plus P. I'm sorry, not consonant, presyllable plus P, but we also have others, and right, and plenty of simplexes there, quite a few, including those imploded Bs there. 20 early Chinese loanword forms, and a good number with presyllable plus P, but also presyllable plus B. Also notable is the W, the the medial W there, and I'll mention that. So based on this, at this point, I'm considering this presyllable plus labial, and that labial can include W, right? And then we have these simplexes here. Okay. Oops. Okay. So lost my spot here. Okay. So let's review. Fairloose in 1992 presented a work on the sources of onsets in Vietnamese with well-supported patterns. Okay, but I've got new data, large quantity of data, and I'm going to provide a preliminary updated list of the sources for onset material in modern Vietnamese, and this expands to include the reconstructions of pre-sesquisyllables and also the old Chinese forms, right? So these include simplexes, simplexes, complexes, and pre-sesquisyllables. And of course, I've marked the capital C for those indefinite forms of the pre-sesquisyllables. Okay, so I think that Fairloose in 1982, dealing with spirantization, this lenition, was pointing out a tendency of the intervocalic phonemes, not making a strong claim. And what you see here is obviously much more complex, bit messy, but still with plenty of patterns. Okay, and keep in mind, this means there was a lot of collapsing of complex onset material into the modern simple simplex onsets. And I think that in part accounts for the complexity. So let's go back here. Of the basic stops, the sources are mostly simplexes, but there are instances of sesquisyllables. What do we do with that? And I'm going to talk about timing, right? I think the timing of the loss of those pre-sesquisyllables is the only way to really deal with it. The fricatives and aspirates are more consistent. All of them here do not have pre-sesquisyllables. Please note that aspirates might be a later stage in Vietic, not deep proto-Vietic, and this is uncertainty is reflected in by Fairloose, by Nguyen, and I agree with that uncertainty. And finally, for the nasals here, we see both implosives and nasals as sources, and that's expected, and it includes the sesquisyllables. However, as I noted, nasals and implosives in intervocalic position do not become the lenited voice fricatives. They stay as they are. Okay, this means we can't know the timing of the loss of presyllables of these ones with nasals in the main syllables, whether it was earlier or later. It's interesting, I think, though, to consider the articulatory acoustic factors that prevented lenition with these sounds. So I hope some phonetics people have some ideas about that, why they would not be lenited. And I don't think it's too hard to explain, but I haven't. I'd like to hear an explanation. So finally, the main softened onsets. Here we see plenty of sesquisyllables, but there are quite a few simplex onsets as well, right? So it's not all clean. But as I noted, they pattern in terms of place of articulation, right? They don't include the nasals or implosives in intervocalic position, okay? Oh, and again, keep in mind, we're looking at both Vietic and Old Chinese reconstructions. So whatever this stuff happened, it happened after that period, okay? Some, broad relative chronology. Okay, so now let's get to an overview. I've presented a lot of data. Overall pattern, a clear majority of modern Vietnamese softened onsets are derived from onsets in prior intervocalic position, majority, right? And we're segments of the same place of articulation as their modern onset counterparts. So it's broader, right? It's some kind of labial something. that becomes that contributes and collapses to the V. Could be even a medial wa, as we saw. The best example of that I'm thinking of is gold, yellow Vietnamese vang, the Sino-Vietnamese form hoang, and so vang is just the wa was enough. Okay, numerous sources of these. The overall variety of source onsets is larger and sometimes appears to include clusters without presyllables in some instances. So, okay, so it's not all perfect, right? We want it to be clean, but it's not all clean. Exclusion. This does not include nasal onsets in intervocalic position or implosive onsets, which were either retained or they merged with nasals. And then the original simplexes, single consonants, some are simply retentions. Some of these, right, of earlier reconstructed simplexes. So ga to ga, well, some kind of ga, V to V, as in ve from Vietic there. But occasionally evidence of presyllabic material is just lacking. And so Vietnamese vat from Vietic pat, and I don't know why. Why did that happen? There's no clear phonetic evidence for it, at least not available yet. So questions, this leads to a number of questions. What were the factors in lenition of Vietnamese main syllable onsets in previous bisyllabic words? So some thoughts. I think of, maybe consciously trying to retain these sesquisyllables, but there was this typological pressure towards reduction. But again, this was in the early second millennium, right? Pretty late. Then we have lenition of the intervocalic onsets, right? That's the condition for it before those sesquisyllables are lost. And then finally, the loss of presyllables had to have been before 1651, before de Rhodes dictionary, right? Where it's clear. Certainly it involved the spreading of voicing from surrounding vowels, but could lenition, and this is a question I don't know the answer to at all, could lenition also represent the phonetic impact of trying to retain presyllabic material? And you'll see why I asked that question when I get to some others. Why did some onset stops in monosyllabic words not undergo lenition in Vietnamese? Let's see here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, I get distracted by the chat. Thought. Loss of presyllables may simply have preceded lenition. Right. That's right. That's what we have to assume. That's possibility. I think that the loss likely varied in timing among the words, more like lexical diffusion, right, than an absolute sound change. And Mark Miyake has published something recently on comparable intervocalic lenition and discusses the hypothesis of varied loss of the presyllables in Credai. So it's sort of interesting that this seems to be a little bit like that. However, in other cases, we must seek out additional conditioning factors. Don't know yet. Right? Why did most varieties of Muong and Nguyen not undergo this lenition of onsets? By the way, I'm going to say most, because in Nguyen Van Thuy's book with 1,200 senses, 1,200 words, Vietnamese, and then about 30 Muong lects, it happens. It's there in some places. So it's not the case that all varieties of Muong do not have it. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated, and I have to look into it more. But it, so could Vietnamese have influenced it? Is it not? Did it actually happen in them? I don't know yet. Okay, many lects, Muong lects, have lost presyllables earlier than Vietnamese did. That's what it seems that would be did, or perhaps they simply didn't go under the lenition. Right, those are two possibilities, and I don't know which is the case. But even some other Vietic languages like Kui retain voiceless stops in that position. Okay, so but I have seen some instances of the conservative polysyllabic Vietic lects having lenition. So my here having that h sound. Okay, a little bit like, and to also, which is not polysyllabic. So it's a bit messier, but I think that it is certainly possible that Vietnamese kept it longer than other varieties did. But obviously, there are other questions and other places to look. What made Vietnamese particularly prone to this lenition? Why? Now, this could be related to marking of sociocultural status. I'm just speculating. There was a developing writing system, maybe some kind of sociocultural preferences in this, okay? Something that's not necessarily phonological is possible. And it could not but it still couldn't overcome the strong typological tendency. Speakers could not do that. Okay. Okay. Oh yeah. So this is my last slide. Evidence of later, some broader implications here. Okay. This is evidence of later sesquisyllabicity. So this data supports the previously presented evidence by Shimizu primarily that Vietnamese retained archaic Vietnamese, right? Retained pre-sesquisyllables into the second millennium. Possibly, this is something to consider, possibly even after the loss of Annamese Chinese, after Annamese, John fans hypothesize Annamese Chinese shifted. So if not, there would have been no environment to trigger this lenition. All right, so obviously it had to have been there. But by the 1651 dictionary, there were only monosyllables, but there were lenited onsets, okay? Something else to consider, tones before monosyllabification. The implication of this is that tones in Vietnamese predated the loss of pre-sesquisyllables by at least a few centuries. But this was centuries later than in Middle Chinese, okay? So while tones naturally developed on monosyllables in Viet Minh, in sesquisyllabic words, they must have developed on major syllables. And we have as a model the modern Chut languages such as Maya and Ruk, which have precisely distinctive tone on the main major syllables, but do not have distinctive tone on the pre-syllable, pre-sesquisyllable. Okay, I believe that's the descriptions I've seen, and I think that's the case. Okay. Last, this revises the view of the impact of Sinitic. That sesquisyllables were retained in the second millennium complicates the view of the impact of language contact with Sinitic. Monosyllabic Middle Chinese was in contact with the ancestor of Vietnamese, right, some kind of Viet Minh something, for more than several centuries before Vietnamese reached a stage of complete monosyllabicity. Only clusters in Vietnamese, onset clusters in Vietnamese lingered even longer into the early 1800s. The typology of modern Vietnamese masks this history. Viet Minh was not a rapidly sinicized language. So there's some broader implications of this topic. And so that's what I have to say. And I'm going to stop sharing. And your questions. I welcome any questions or comments you have.